talk about this latest news about what looks like now a criminal investigation into General Motors?
Well, a criminal investigation is certainly warranted. General Motors knew about the defect in 2004. They kept getting feedback of fatalities, crashes, airbags not going off, engines being shut off in the subsequent years. They covered it up. They didn't report it to the Department of Transportation's Auto Safety Agency. And they didn't even notify the CEO of GM, Mary Berry, until January 31st of this year. That's a pattern that fits the predicates for a criminal prosecution, which I understand the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York is now pursuing. But what this whole tragic episode reveals, Amy, is not just layers of bureaucracy in General Motors that prevent serious problems from going to the decision makers arguing for a recall, but it also shows the ineptitude of the National Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, in the Department of Transportation, that knew about this years ago, didn't think it qualified for a recall, and it has to reveal a lot of internal documents, both in terms of its own operations and its relations with General Motors, that has been demanded specifically by Clarence Ditlow, the director of the Center for Auto Safety. So I hope this will swell up into a good recall, a good correction, which will take weeks for 1.6 million vehicles to be straightened out. And the congressional hearings will hopefully lead to stronger and tougher auto safety laws and penalties.
Ralph, Nader, can you explain why it is that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration took so long to take action? You've suggested that they're massively underfunded. Was that the problem?
Well, that's one of them. I think the auto safety section of the budget is about $45 million a year, which compares with the $650 million a year that taxpayers pay for guarding the embassy in Baghdad and its personnel. You see the priorities here. Safety on the highway should be a real priority. But it's also a culture of timidity in the Auto Safety Agency, or NHTSA as it's called, a culture of timidity bred by the lack of backing by the Bush White House and to some similar extent by the Obama White House. And that, of course, leads to a reluctance to follow up on the evidence, to stand tall for the American motorists. And that is not why we established the Auto Safety Agency in 1966. So maybe this will help turn it around. Often it takes a tragedy like this to turn it around.
General Motors filed a timeline with federal investigators that shows when it first became aware of the problems with the ignition switches turning off in some cars it made between 2003 and 2007, and when it finally issued the recall of 6 of those models last month, about, as you were saying, 1.6 million cars. This is CBS News reporter Jeff Glor recapping early reports of the problems.
2004, GM became aware of at least one incident involving a Chevy Cobalt. An inquiry was opened, but after consideration of the lead time required, cost and effectiveness of the solutions, it is closed with no action. 2005, new field reports of engines losing power. A service bulletin was issued to dealers in case customers complained, saying there's the potential for the driver to inadvertently turn off the ignition. The concern is more likely to occur if the driver is short and has a large and/or heavy keychain. But no recall was issued. 2007, a GM engineer began an investigation. New incidents of airbags not deploying are discovered. 2010, GM discontinued production of the Cobalt.
That's from CBS. Now I want to read from New York Times story about consumer complaints of the potentially dangerous shutdowns in 6 GM models. They were submitted to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration at the rate of about 2 per month since 2003. The Times reports, quote, to the mounting complaints, the safety agency sometimes responded with polite but formulaic letters similar to one it sent in December 2010 to Barney Frank, then a congressman from Massachusetts, Massachusetts, who'd written on behalf of a distraught constituent whose 2006 Cobalt kept stalling. In the letter to Mr. Frank, the agency said it had reviewed its database of complaints to determine if a safety defect trend existed. Quote, at this time, there is insufficient evidence to warrant opening a safety defect investigation, the letter concluded. Ralph Nader, talk about this whole sequence.
Well, the sequence reflects the unwillingness of the Secretary of Transportation and the chief of the Auto Safety Agency to really pay attention to auto defects and not just the GM problem. This would not likely have happened under Joan Claybrook, who ran the Auto Safety Agency under President Carter, because she met every week with the defect recall manager, every week, in her office, going through every single bit of evidence that might lead to trends that might lead to rapid action for recalls. That's one. The second is that the GM bankruptcy, when the taxpayer bailed out GM in 2009, they created a new GM and immunized GM from all the product liability lawsuits that have been filed on behalf of deceased or next of kin regarding defects in GM cars. They just wiped them off. And what I'm pressing for now in this terrible tragedy that's unfolding is that General Motors voluntarily waive that immunity and allow all those product liability cases that were already in the courts or already filed or about to be filed to be brought to judicial evaluation. In other words, reinstate the cases, and it's not just the 1.6 million category of Chevy Cobalt. It's all the other GM cars that had defects that produced deaths and injuries and whose cases were immunized by the bankruptcy judge in New York City. Unprecedented and very cruel to those people. So we're going to go for that as well as press for criminal charges.
Should GM executives be charged with murder?
It all depends on the evidence of how high up the knowledge of the deadly defect percolated and the extent to which they covered it up. That's why the internal investigation of GM by CEO Mary Berry and the congressional investigation and the Department of Transportation and the U.S. Attorney in New York, I think they'll get to the bottom of it, as well as the media on top of it. This is not just a dozen or 13 fatalities. There's more to be discovered, but it reflects the failure of the regulatory process because of the power of members of Congress like retiring John Dingell from Michigan, who made a career out of stamping down on the Auto Safety Agency in the Department of Transportation, not just in terms of opposing strong safety enforcement and penalties, but also fuel efficiency advances and emission controls. So this can open up a whole new opportunity to protect the American people and to support those engineers inside General Motors who have tried to do the right thing but weren't backed up.